So, Brandon, you're saying I don't need to be sipping protein and having 12 or basically nonstop protein feedings all day, but maybe 1 or 2 is not adequate. Where's the optimal ground? Where do you fall?
Great question. So most researchers agree that somewhere in the range of 3 to
Muscle protein synthesis, part 3 with the mad scientist and Brandon. We want to talk about putting this all together today. So everything that we've discussed in the last 2 series, let's put it all together. So Brandon, you want to start us off?
Absolutely.
And I will provide my input as we're walking through the source material.
Absolutely. So the last thing we want to cover here in optimizing muscle protein synthesis is protein distribution and meal frequency. So when talking about this, we first need to lay out the groundwork for understanding that. Why does protein distribution matter? The reason it matters so much is because we have a ability to store carbs. It's semi-limited, but we do have an ability to store carbs within the liver, within the skeletal muscle. We do have a great ability to store fat, virtually unlimited amounts of fat. But protein, we don't really store it. So because we don't store it, it's far more important, especially when trying to maximize muscle protein synthesis, to have our protein feedings throughout the day be very dialed in and very specific, which we'll get into here in just a second. Now, the next thing we want to cover here is that the anabolic response to protein is not linear. A lot of individuals think that if you have a 200-gram protein bolus in one feeding, that's more protein, right? That's more of an anabolic response. But this couldn't be further from the truth. And this is actually fairly common.
Yeah, it is. And there's a number of individuals out there too, well-known nutritionists and stuff, and they'll want to point to research that protein timing doesn't matter. But I haven't actually pulled in depth in any of that research, because the simple thing comes down to if it doesn't matter, if I'm going to get my 250 grams of protein in a day, how am I going to make that happen realistically? So those studies are typically being done with smaller individuals at smaller protein requirements, where maybe 100 grams of protein a day is adequate. And maybe 2 feedings a day would be possible, or 3 would be possible. But once we start pushing these numbers, and we're going to go into those numbers specifically, the realistic portion of actually being able to digest that amount through just a couple feedings a day, you can't pull it off physically. So why even go down that path of arguing some theoretical points when it's the real world? We're larger people, we want to put on mass, we're going to be eating at these amounts because of the pieces that we discussed in the prior in this series. So anyway, I just want to touch on that because there will be some argument or pushback on this distribution. And to Brandon's point, fats and carbs. So these things like carb intake, it doesn't even matter necessarily just the daily. Like, you can have more carbs one day or the next and still be holding those carbs in those other tissue for use. Fats, again, massive windows of time for storage there. But protein really comes down to that daily amount. And to pull that daily amount in, you're gonna have to split that up into some feedings. So that's what we're gonna talk to. But what happens let's talk about the thresholds.
Absolutely, yeah. So when it comes to thresholds, why the point he's making is so important is because if timing didn't matter, if meal frequency doesn't matter, then someone's likely going to be eating, let's say, 2 meals per day. That'd be pretty sweet to be able to do. Only 2 meals a day and optimizing muscle protein synthesis. Sign me up. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't work that way. We have both a minimal threshold as well as a maximal threshold in terms of how much protein we can intake in one meal and still receive the maximal anabolic response. But the big question people have is, does this mean if I have over 50 grams of protein, let's say I have 100 grams of protein in one meal, is the last 50 grams just wasted? And that couldn't be further from the truth. It's not wasted, it's just that extra 50 grams isn't necessarily going to have a very good anabolic effect on our muscle tissue.
Yes, and So this window is pretty wide. The window is wide for a reason though, because if, let's say, I had 100 grams of whey isolate, okay? Honestly, most of that is going to be actually wasted. But now I'm gonna have a meal with, maybe I've got a little whey in there because I've got some Greek yogurt, got some cottage cheese, I've got some steak, I've got all sorts of different types. Well, even throwing fats in, let's just say, I'm gonna put some olive oil in my protein shake, for example, is gonna really change how fast that digest through that lower intestine. So those absorption rates are going to be very different. And so that protein is going to be different and available and hitting the bloodstream at different timings. So that's why this threshold is pretty wide. Now Brandon's talking about 2 meals a day. Can you get it all in? I have experience with this. So I've done like intermittent fasting during the course of my career for probably about 6 or 7 years total at periods of time. I did do 1 year where I ate 1 meal a day, all right? And I got lean, I got shredded during that, and it was a 2 to 4 hour window, and I would eat all of my protein requirements for the day during that. During that year, I retained my muscle mass. I did not put on any muscle mass. So there's a difference between retention and actually ability to put that muscle on. So, and that's where maybe some of those pieces of, it doesn't matter. Well, yeah, I was able to retain my muscle mass with that, but man, I was bloated. My stomach would be distended during those meal periods as well. I was uncomfortable, I was sweaty, it wasn't enjoyable, and I wasn't building muscle. So anyway, just to give you some real world experience of kind of what we're talking about and why this window is so variable as well.
Yeah.
And if you have 60 grams of protein in a meal, you're still going to use it, but again, that extra little bit, it's probably not going to be useful for building that muscle as opposed to if I move that to another feeding during the day.
Absolutely, and that's very important to touch on because some individuals think over 50 grams means that it's just being, actually, I've heard this once that drove me crazy, actually from a dietitian, which is really scary. Anything over 50 grams in a meal gets turned into fat. I've actually heard that before, which is unbelievable. So when we say that it's somewhat wasted, we're referring to the anabolic effects, not so much it's going to be added on as fat automatically or something like that.
But that's, sometimes people make those statements not because it's not accurate, but they're trying to get through the point of, if you're having too much of anything as a whole, your dietary needs are 3,200 calories a day and you're eating 5,000 and it's all extra protein to get to the 5,000, you are going to gain fat. But that's because you're in a caloric excess. So, but not 50 to 60 grams, that 10 grams is going to fat. That's not how that works.
Absolutely.
So just to take that argument to try to argue from that other person's, try to make it make sense, that would be a way to
Absolutely, kind of playing devil's advocate there.
Yeah.
But talking about this here further, the main reason this is such a discrepancy, it's such a big range, is mainly because the protein quality matters as well. So for example, the main thing that differs here is actually going to be leucine content. So it also matters on leucine content. If your grams of protein, for example, are coming from less sufficient sources, let's say things like wheat gluten, let's say things like beans, rice, things like that, you might need over 50 grams to actually fully stimulate muscle protein synthesis, but this is assuming that you're getting decent sources here. So the reason this range is there, for the main reason that range is there, is because of the actual protein quality you're having, the leucine content of said meal. That's very important to touch on as well. Now, the next thing I want to touch on here.
Don't be afraid of taking more than 50. That's...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to refractory periods, this is something that there's a lot of debate about, but just understand that when it comes to refractory periods, what this states is that it takes about 4 to 5 hours after a meal for your amino acids to actually return back to baseline, right? So the way I like to put this is like a sponge. If you were to take a dry sponge and soak it up with water, it can soak a ton of water. But if you take a sponge that's already wet and try to soak up water, it doesn't get much. And the main idea of this refractory period and how it ties in is because a lot of research is being done right now, and a lot of people have the opinion that your amino acids, your protein, muscle protein synthesis has to hit a valley before it can get fully stimulated again. So a lot of individuals that think more protein is better, let's sip it throughout the day, let's have my branched chains, my essentials, my this, my that, and they're just taking a steady stream throughout the day. This isn't inherently good. In fact, there's some research that shows this actually could could blunt your response and hurt muscle protein synthesis. So it may be a better idea to understand what a refractory period is and wait around 4-ish, 5-ish hours per meal. A lot of people have the mindset that the more steady stream, the better, or the waiting every 2 to 3 hours to have a meal is better. It's not necessarily better. We would actually argue that because of refractory periods, it may just be that waiting those longer periods of time and waiting for your amino acid pool to get to a valley may help to actually stimulate it better again.
Yeah, you can't overwork biology. We are always going to be bouncing between catabolic and anabolic, right? And if we're just trying to trick the system and never have that negative effect, there is actually reasons to be there. All you're going to do is make it just these tiny little boop, 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 like this, and so you're actually always going to maybe kind of be there. It's just like training. You can't train all the time. You've got to train and stimulate that need and then take a break, and that's going to create the need for recovery and repair. So just, you don't need to be, and then what happens when you go to bed? You're going to put in an IV drip line? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the two examples I always like to bring up here is that if you are having 200 grams of protein per day being your goal, first person 2 protein servings of 100 grams each, the second person being 4 protein feedings at 50 grams each, which is going to be better at maximizing muscle protein synthesis. And based upon this above information and the clear consensus of research, literature, and the opinions of the best protein researchers in the world, clearly it's going to be this guy over here. Because again, we have to pay attention to the maximal threshold, the minimal threshold, and understand that if you're eating 2 huge or even 3 huge protein feedings per day, you're likely going to really miss out on the full anabolic effects to that 200 grams protein per day.
So, Brandon, you're saying I don't need to be sipping protein and having 12 or basically nonstop protein feedings all day, but maybe 1 or 2 is not adequate. Where's the optimal ground? Where do you fall?
Great question. So most researchers agree that somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 is good, but if you're an athlete, if you're somebody that's really trying to maximize muscle protein synthesis as much as possible, I would actually say the baseline is closer to 4, and that's agreed upon by many protein researchers as well. At least 4 protein feedings per day.
Let's think about the application. If you're somebody that's protein requirements are 100, 120, 140 grams per day, 3's probably adequate. But as soon as we start getting up here, where a lot of people that, person on the other side of this camera that's listening to this, it's not going to work. Like my baseline, so even when I was intermittent fasting for the bulk number of those years, at 16, which again, I'm not promoting IF, but I would still, at a minimum, get 4 feedings a day in, and honestly, I still get 5. Like that's and today 5 has been my baseline. Even though I don't eat a lot in the first part of the day, I'm gonna have my scoop of 80-20 in the morning, I'm gonna have my lunch, I'm gonna have my protein either right before or during my training, I'm gonna have dinner, and I'm gonna have another scoop of 80-20 before bed. Straight up, 5 baseline every day. That's what I do. That's my experience.
Exactly. And I'm closer to 5 myself. 4, I would say, there's a bare minimum to fully maximize protein synthesis. But like Duffin just touched on, it does matter the size of the individual and the protein needs they have for the day. Because if someone that needs 300 grams per day may need a different amount of feedings per day than someone that needs 100 grams per day. And in fact, less of a may, more of they definitely do. So that's important to consider as well. So the last thing I want to start to talk about here is putting it all together. So if we go to this board over here, you'll see putting it all together. So I want to go ahead and go over everything we've covered in our series so far, a 3-part series so far. So first and foremost, the most important thing here is making sure we get enough protein per day in the general range we typically like to talk about here. And this is the consensus being 0.8 to 1.1 grams per pound body weight. That's a fantastic range for most people.
It's so easy to calculate too.
Exactly.
I weigh 240. I need 240, maybe a little less, a little more.
Yeah.
And some variability there too. Think about your training. If you're going on vacation, you're doing a deload for a week, you could probably fall on the lower end, and that's going to have kind of similar effect to this refractory period as well, because when you get back to it, the body's going to be able to be more responsive to absorbing and utilizing that. And there's just no reason when you don't have that level of demand on the body. But if I'm pushing training hard, I've got a big event, I'm training really heavy, I'm going to be pushing that higher end of it going, I'm 240, but I might need 260, 270 grams of protein a day. So think about those things as they roll. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the second thing here is considering protein quality too. If protein quality is not considered, you're not going to be able to fully maximize muscle protein synthesis. The one quick example I'll go over is leucine. Leucine being the trigger for muscle protein synthesis. You need to make sure you get a certain amount of it per meal to really truly optimize that portion, that facet of getting bigger, stronger, better, whatever you may want to call it. So protein quality also extremely important to consider. And just to recap here, protein quality is making sure your protein content has good bioavailability and good amino acid content.
So if you're drinking your egg whites, it means a whole lot more. We got to double those quantities because you're only absorbing 40-50%.
Yeah, as fun it is to pretend you're Rocky and just pound a bunch of raw eggs, it's not great for bioavailability to say the least. Third here is achieve at least 2 to 3 grams of leucine per meal. Again, leucine, the trigger for muscle protein synthesis, is definitely the most important amino acid to pay attention to when you're trying to maximize this facet of your nutrition. And then lastly, at least 4 evenly dosed and spread protein feedings per day is what's going to be needed to optimize this as well. So if you're following these 4, these are kind of the most basic, most important aspects of fully optimizing muscle protein synthesis.
Awesome. That was really great and usable information. I believe this is our final piece in this series on muscle protein synthesis. So look forward to joining us for more conversations and education in the future.